Hello, welcome to the, oh,
Wow.
sounds a little, I feel a little echoey here. That's what I hear. Can we fix that? Hello?
That's going to be aggravating. Try again.
Now?
Good.
No, does that sound better? Yes, okay, good. You know what, I don't have to be so close to the mic. All right, take two. Welcome to the Larkspur Planning Commission meeting of August 22. Could we please have a roll call?
Commissioner Chalmers.
Present.
Commissioner Wagstaff.
Present.
Commissioner Swisher.
Present.
Commissioner Campbell.
Present.
And Commissioner Max Williamson is absent tonight. So you have a quorum.
Thank you. And I see a number of people on Zoom. Are there a number of people on Zoom? Or am I imagining that?
It's our two consultants and the other, oh, there's some attendees too. Yes, there are some attendees.
Okay, great. So is there anybody on Zoom or in the audience here tonight who has any public comments on matters not on the agenda? Nothing? Great, thank you. In that case, we'll move on to the planning director's report, please.
Thank you. The city council's scheduled to consider the rent stabilization ordinance on September 6th. And that's all I have to report tonight, unless you have any questions for me.
In that case, we'll start the public portion of the hearing tonight. We have two items on the agenda. The first is 419 Elm Avenue, 2156. If we could please have the staff report.
Yes, give me just a second to share my screen here. There we go. Okay. So good evening, Chair, Planning Commissioners. The project before you is design review, slope use permit, and floor area exception 2156 for 419 Elm Avenue. The project seeks to grade the rear yard to allow for the construction of a multi-tiered terrace, which includes an outdoor kitchen and bathroom, a pool, and an associated equipment shed. The subject property has a slope of 27%, and the project proposes 110 cubic yards of cut and 30 cubic yards of fill, which does trigger the requirement of a slope use permit. The applicants did provide a geotechnical report as well as a construction management plan, which have all been peer reviewed and deemed adequate by city staff and consultants. Regarding the floor area exception, the property is allowed a floor area of 22.1% by code because of the slope of the lot. In 1986, the property applied for and received an exception permit to allow a floor area ratio of 30%, which is about where the subject property stands now. The proposed bathroom and pool equipment shed will increase the FAR of the lot to 31.7%, which triggers the need for that exception permit again. At that time, there were no neighbor complaints or comments on the 1986 application. Everyone was supportive. And finally, design review is required as the project does have discretionary approvals in the slope use permit and the floor area exception. The outdoor bathroom, kitchen, and the pool equipment shed on their own wouldn't rise to the requirement for a design review. The project has been reviewed by all applicable departments who have given conditions of approval for the project and deemed it complete to move forward. We've received no comments on the project, and staff recommends that the Planning Commission review the information, hold a public hearing, and approve this project subject to findings, conditions of approval, and a Class 3 CEQA exemption. That's all I have for you. I'm available for any questions, and I believe the owner is on the call as well if you'd like to hear from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Do we have any questions for staff?
I had one quick question. It was more just me musing, I guess, but if they did an 800 square foot ADU, they wouldn't be asking for a floor area exception. Okay.
All right, thank you, Brock. Do we have any comments or any presentation from the applicant?
I do not see how to turn on a camera.
Oh.
Can you hear me? This is Kenneth Holder.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's good to once again be here to present to the Planning Commission. I appreciate your time very much. This is a, I'd love to, I'm not getting any of the screen control buttons here. No share screen. Okay, join as panelists. Thank you.
You give us a second. I think staff is trying to figure it out. You now have control of your screen, Mr. Holder. Mr. Holder, have we lost you?
Unmute. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
It
Okay.
muted me again. Okay, you can see my screen now then, I guess. Right. Well, thank you. It's great to be here once again presenting to the Planning Commission. And again, I really appreciate your time. Oh, I realized there we go. And this is a project that I have been working with the applicants for quite some time. There were a fair number of sensitive site-specific issues that we've worked through, working with neighbors. We've been through a number of planners working with this. And I think we've really adequately satisfied all the requirements. So this design, we're quite proud of it. It actually is something that, you know, the applicants, both Melissa Coleman and Sean Neems, they have a growing young family, and this is a somewhat otherwise undeveloped downsloping yard at their house on Elm. And this was the most appropriate or the most useful for their family was clearly they wanted a pool and a terraced area that they could entertain and enjoy with their small children. In this rendering, you can kind of see the overall thinking was they have a playroom on the lower level that has sliding doors that lead out to an existing deck, and through a set of stairs that comes down to a lower level, there would be an outdoor barbecue, outdoor dining, a small trellis, a small lounge area, and then of course a pool bath that supports the use of this lower level that has a pool. And then there's a small play area down here for children with just low retaining walls surrounded by planting. And we use that area for the pool equipment shed. So just to sort of explain our thinking is, you know, it's a very sensitive issue in the town of Larkspur. We wanted to be able to provide this while still being compliant with the natural slope requirements. We've gone to the trouble that all of the green areas are permeable artificial turf to, you know, minimize water use, but also maximize the permeability of the site. We have a civil engineer who has provided an intensive, you know, a fully enclosed water retention system, and we're using the lower part of the site to make sure that any of this additional, you know, there is some impermeable area. We're basically collecting and retaining all site runoff. That had been in the past. There was some evidence that that had been an issue. So our civil engineer has designed a robust system to make sure we've eliminated and, if anything, improved an existing situation. So the both sides of this project, both sides has a series of screening trees, and we're using existing vegetation on this side, which seems quite tall and satisfactory to everyone. And then I don't know if you actually had a chance to go to the site, but we're proposing a screening of Arbutus marina trees to address the privacy request for the neighbor to the right. The planting plan, we feel like this is a very appropriate low water use palette of plants that we find very appropriate for this climate zone. And it has been, we are working with a local landscape architect to implement this and to make sure that everything is planted appropriately. Going back to this design, I would want to point out also that we've gone to considerable effort to really to work with the natural grade. And the only, actually this section here probably most carefully illustrates the level that we went to make sure that no structure was was elevated above the site any more than absolutely necessary. We wanted to be, sensitive to the neighbors. Everyone has a view this direction. And so really it seemed that the level that we went to terrace and then terrace again and then terrace again, the tallest structure is this trellis, basically. Everything else is held very tightly down to match the existing grade shown here in the dashed lines. So apparently this, this has worked because there hasn't really been much feedback. There have been some questions from one of the neighbors once the design review package was sent out. I believe that has all been addressed. I don't know if we've got letters of support, but we definitely have. I think no news is basically good news. We haven't had anyone who, so this drawing here was actually sent out just to really make sure everyone understood. The two areas of concern that I heard was, okay, if you're putting in a pool equipment shed, how close is that to the property line? We've gone to great effort to put those in the center, well out of any side yard or rear yard setbacks. So they're 25 and 26 feet from the property line. Also, the equipment shed, even though it wasn't required, it has a fairly clear sound attenuating construction details. We didn't want there to be any issues. So we're actually doing double layer construction. We're showing very clearly this isn't just some slat or lattice kind of construction. This is an enclosure that would be, I think would basically make the mechanical system completely imperceptible. But we are also stipulating, following the Larkspur noise ordinance that talks about 50 decibels at 7 to 10 p.m. and then 40 decibels is the maximum for anything between 10 and 7 a.m. The pump system that's being proposed is 45 decibels, so it's going to be in that range. But then, of course, we would like to stipulate that the timer for the pumps, it's usually customary to have them run late morning when they just would be absolutely the least objectionable to anyone else. So this has been placed to create a collective understanding that sound is in this site is quite important. So I feel like we have done everything possible to minimize and prevent any objection to anyone else. And I feel like this project really reflects that. if the owners are here, I don't know if they wanted to present or talk about their experience, but I know that they've made themselves very available to anyone who had any comments. Otherwise, that concludes my my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holder. Do we have any questions for the architect?
I just have one, and it's not. Sorry. Here we go. So I just noticed that the pool pump, from a practical standpoint, is below the grade of the pool. I have that situation in my pool, and one thing I would just caution is that you have some kind of fail-safe system, because if there's a break in that line, the entire pool drains immediately. So, like for instance, if there's a clamshell filter accidentally pops, or if any of the PVC pipes get a leak in them, you lose all your water. And there's ways to prevent that. This is just a piece of advice from someone who has been in a similar situation.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's I have heard of that happening. The subcontractor that has already been negotiated with, he's one of the highest skilled pool contractors I know in the region, and I'm sure he has that built in, but I will pass that on.
Yeah, just
that could be a bad situation.
That's wisdom. That's hard-earned wisdom.
Okay.
You're hearing there.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Do we have any comments either from the owner or from anyone in the public?
The owner did raise their hand. I'm going to stop you from sharing here, Kenneth. Sorry. Okay, and then here's the owner. He just needs to unmute. There we go.
Hi there. I don't know if we can put our video on either. Join as a panelist.
Did we lose them completely?
No,
We're here.
The panelist.
Okay.
Oh, there they are. Great. Okay.
I'm Melissa.
Sean.
We're the owners. I just want to reiterate, thank you all so much for all the time that has gone into this review. When we bought the house, we went into contract the day before shelter in place. So I always tell people that's a very special little tidbit about our purchase. And I was pregnant with our second, who was born in July of 2020. And when we bought the house and we bought we looked at the area, we were really, really excited about the opportunity to make this our home and to, really live here for a long time, build community, make a lot of friends, which, we've been really fortunate to do within the neighborhood. And we have a guest visitor who is also here. But that's my 3-year-old. And that's how long that we've been working on this, which is also fun to watch. But, this project for us has really just always been about establishing this home as a long-term place for us that we could grow into and evolve and really enjoy, entertain, but have our family and stay local and just be part of the community. And it's funny, our kids are at Marin Primary right down the hill. And, all of our friends keep, saying, oh, how's your project coming along? And everybody's like, we can't wait to come over. We can't wait to spend time with you guys and, celebrate and all that. So, a lot of the neighbors have been really supportive and, we've really tried to go out of our way to be as open and forthcoming. Anybody who has questions, anybody has concerns, we're an open book. This has always been, for us, even with working with Kenneth, was we don't know what we can and can't do. Just tell us what we can and can't do, and we're happy to make that work. So that's always been the spirit of this project for us. So we really appreciate the consideration, open for any questions or any feedback. I also appreciate the wisdom and the advice. So we will take all of it. He grew up with a pool on the East Coast. I did not. I have no idea how to take care of a pool. He will be in charge. So we will take all the advice on making sure that we don't lose water or break anything.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for the owner? No. Thank you. Do we have any comments from anyone in the public or in the audience?
There's no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, and we didn't have any comments from the neighbors, right? There was nothing. Great. Okay, in that case, thank you. We'll bring it back to the commission for deliberation. Does anyone want to go first?
I'll go first, yeah.
Go down the line.
I could. Very nice design. I think it's very well drafted and nicely designed. I think you're going to really enjoy that. It's as I said, we have a pool and we put ours in after we built a pool. The house is an old house, but and it's really been an amazing place. And it's great for kids. Just be careful of obviously, drowning and stuff like that. Just that's the doctor in me. Just be careful. So I have no objections to it. I think it's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm of the same mind. I think it's a well done project, and I'm sure they'll enjoy it for years in the future.
Thank you very much. Liam?
Yeah, like my other commissioners who have gone so far, I think it's well designed. It looks nice. And the slope use permit, it seems like that's sort of a necessity on a hillside site. And then the floor area exception, I think it's reasonable and in keeping with the general plan and the community. So I'm prepared to make that exception as well. So
thank you very much. And again, I actually agree with my fellow commissioners as well. I can make the findings for the 3 permits which have been applied for. So I think we can make a motion and go for a vote.
wow, thank you guys. Okay, I move to approve project 21-56 at 419 Elm Avenue, the slope use permit, floor area ratio exception, and design review.
Can we have a second, please?
Second.
Can we have a roll call, please?
Sure. Commissioner Chalmers?
Yes.
Commissioner Wagstaff?
Yes.
Commissioner Swisher?
Yes.
And Commissioner Campbell?
Yes.
And Max Williamson's absent, so the motion carries 4-1 or 4-0.
Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time and your interest.
So much. This means a lot to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the review of the draft ordinance and resolution to modify the city's development regulations and to adopt the objective standard and development standards for mixed use and multifamily housing developments. And I guess we need to make a recommendation to City Council. So if we could please have the staff report or presentation on this.
Thank you. I'll start and introduce our consultants that are out in the audience. We have our consultants, David Mastenson and Ryan Call, that have been working on this project since last year. They were retained just as I was starting here. So it's been that portion with Larkspur has been going on a while, but the project as a whole has was started in about 2019. And my predecessor, Neil Toft, was working with the other planning directors in the County of Marin on a toolkit of objective standards using grant funds from this state grant, SB2 grant, which contributed $160,000 towards this project. And the first part of the project was for the county. The county hired a consultant, Opticos Design, to develop a toolkit that each of the communities could customize for themselves in order to develop objective standards for considering multifamily housing projects. And that project was completed in 2020, that's been 2021. And then each of the communities was off to customize that toolkit for themselves. And the city of Larkspur retained David Masterson and Ryan Call in order to do that customization. And they worked with our housing steering committee, which is made up of 2 council members and 2 planning commissioners. And the planning commissioners were Brock Wagstaff and also David Kunstler, who is no longer on the planning commission, but he remained on that committee after. Oh, Daniel, sorry, but he remained on that committee, and they recommended approval of this document at their last meeting, which is about a week or two ago. So at this point, they haven't seen the draft ordinance or the resolution, but we prepared that for the Planning Commission in order to the ordinance and the resolution would be required in order to make this part of the city's zoning regulations. And what we're recommending would be to adopt the resolution, which amends the general plan in order to refer to these objective standards. And also it would amend the Central Larkspur specific plan, also known as the CLASP, and the downtown specific plan in order to refer to these standards because they do conflict with the 2-story height limit that's in those documents. But most of the standards in both the CLASP and the CLASP and the downtown specific plan are fairly subjective. And staff would continue to recommend that people comply with those standards, but the objective standards would really be the only ones the city can apply for a multifamily project. So just to backstep again, we're doing this because the state has eliminated the city's discretion to consider a lot of multifamily housing projects. As you saw with the Magnolia Village project down the street, you're only able to deny a project based on not complying with objective standards. And the city has few objective standards. Generally, they're just a height limit, floor area, lot coverage, and setback standards. And there's not a whole lot of other standards related to design or massing of a building. So these objective standards are proposed in order to fill in that gap in standards so that when the multifamily standard projects come through, there's some basis to judge whether or not they comply. The city's on a deadline to receive the grant funds. And so the city needs to adopt some piece of this document in order to receive the $160,000 of SB2 grant funds. And that piece has to be adopted by September 30th. So we have this scheduled for 2 council meetings in September in hopes of having it adopted by that deadline. But as I said, we just need to adopt some piece in order to get those funds. And so, for example, you could just apply standards to Larkspur Landing. You could recommend approval of the entire document, or any other piece could move forward, and the entire document doesn't have to be approved. Also, even if it's approved in its entirety, the city can always revise it and come back again. But because it's an ordinance, it does have to go through the Planning Commission and the City Council again for any sort of amendments. I'm going to turn it over to David Masterson and Ryan Call, who have been working with that committee for months in order to prepare this draft. And they also did a lot of analysis of how the standards would apply to existing buildings that you're already familiar with. And as you've seen in the document too, they've made some examples of how development could occur following the standards in other places in the city. So I'm going to, they already promoted panelists, but go ahead, David, if you'd like to make the presentation.
Great, thank you, Elise, and well said. And thank you to all the commissioners that are here tonight. Ryan Call, my colleague from Urban Field, and I have been working with the steering committee for a year on this and looking at what makes Larkspur in terms of built form. And we've taken that document that Elise talked about, which was a 360-page document by Opticos, and we've narrowed it down to, I think, about 150, 140 pages now. And we've really distilled it down to something that is specific to Larkspur. We removed some of the things that were not Larkspur specific, and we also removed a lot of the building typologies and architectural styles. So I want to go through a show today which briefly goes over the zones and the height limits and all of that. But then I also want to show how it would be applied by a developer or an architect. And then show some example sites of buildings that are currently in Larkspur or nearby, and whether they would be compliant under these new odds or not. So start the slideshow. So as Elise mentioned, the objective design development standards are being put in place to allow guardrails of design guidelines for the city when developers come in with an SB 35 or an SB 330 project. We are trying to provide objective standards of height and width and massing, which are different than a lot of subjective standards. Sometimes you'll see standards that are written to say a setback should be commensurate with the neighborhood look and feel. Obviously, that is subjective. We are trying to put set limits on those things, and I think the document as a whole does that, and it does it in a way that is very uniquely Larkspur. In terms of the order of how we work through the document, the first two chapters talk about the process, and they welcome you to the way you work through it. You find your zone, which I'll talk about, and then you go through to your site and you figure out your buildable area and your parking requirements, and then you look to see how your building or structure will front the street and what that relationship to the street is. And then we have a section about larger sites. It would apply to a few sites in Larkspur, and there's some talk about materials as well. So the Opticos odds originally had a total of 8 zones that they created that varied from density. The lowest density was the T3 edge neighborhood at the top left, and the highest density was a T5 core Main Street on the bottom right. Of these, we felt that 4 of them were applicable to the city of Larkspur, and those are the ones in the orange boxes, and those are the ones that I'm going to go through tonight. So the 4 zones that we are using are T3, the least dense, up to T5, the most dense. And this slide shows how those zones relate to your current zoning districts, so you can have a feel for which districts are zoned in what way in terms of density. And then there was a question about what the housing element sites are in relationship to these zones. So it's a little hard to see on this slide, but the purple outline sites are the housing element sites within the city of Larkspur, and it shows that they fall in almost all of the zones. So I want to talk through the zones specifically. So starting with the least dense, the T3, the intent of this zone is to emulate single family scale massing. Obviously, the guidelines here are for multifamily housing, and that would include potentially an ADU. So this is the lowest scale massing. And, when you look around Larkspur, there are some images in Larkspur of this type of built typology where you might have 2 units in one building that looks like a single family house. You might have some deeper units where at the street frontage, it looks like a single family house, but you have multiple units. There's usually one curb cut. And the parking, depending on what the slope is, and I think that's something that we analyze pretty closely. Sometimes the parking in these districts, if it's a steep upslope or downslope, is at the front of the site. Other times it moves further back in the site. And I want to give credit to Ryan, because Ryan went through Larkspur very carefully and tried to understand the typologies of the existing buildings, because so much of what makes a place and the built form isn't about the architectural style. It's about how far it's set back, what the distance is between buildings, how tall the building is, how much of a rear yard there is if you have a rear neighbor. The actual architecture, whether it's a Tudor or a Craftsman, these don't make as big of a deal. And I think Larkspur's really fortunate in that you have a very wide variety of architectural styles. You have everything from historic to modern and everything in between. So you have a lot of opportunity to explore. And when we looked at the original odds, that really told you that you had to do something that was Tudor or Craftsman or modern, it was a little limiting for what Larkspur has to offer. So the T3 single family scale massing, the way that we have created this section is that it is based on your lot width. And there's a maximum lot width of 75 feet, which is typical for this type of zone in Larkspur. And then within that site, you can then size your building in terms of the width of the building, the depth of the building, and then the size of any sort of wings, and then any sort of accessories structure in the back, and then also how the parking should lay out in relationship to the road and to those houses. Building height is always something people are interested in. So the building height for the T3 zone is 2.5 floors is the base. With the affordable housing bonus, that gets up to 3 floors. I think that's commensurate with what is in the district typically, especially when you think of sloped roofs. And a lot of people ask, what is 2.5 floors? So that half floor is this situation where you might have a slightly sloping site and that you have the drive that goes around and down to the garage, but you have like a stoop on the front side. The next density up is the T4SN, and this is attached housing at the transitional scale. You can see on this map that is generally clustered in the north central area and some in the northwest area. And for this, again, around Larkspur, there's a lot of really diverse examples, you know, of some good projects, some projects that might be a little bit dated, but, you know, I think they're all pretty successful for what they are. One of the things is when you get to this scale and you get to this number of units, the way you handle parking is critical. You will see some buildings that do the parking under, and we've tried to address that. You see some with the carports like you see on the top right. So that's something because you have to have, you're looking at having more cars. You really have to find a way to treat that in a way that does not negatively impact the public way. In this zone, the building height remains the same, 2.5 to 3 floors. And as you can see on the diagram here in the top right, you can understand there's a 150-foot maximum design lot width now instead of the 75 for the T3. There's a little bit of increased width and depth, so you can do something a little more substantial in terms of multifamily. You're no longer in that purely single family typology. You've now moved up into something that's kind of a small multifamily buildings. And then at the next scale up, the T4 SMS is really it's infill development, but most importantly, it is your downtown. It's an historic downtown. And, you know, that's something that we were really cognizant of trying to preserve. And, you know, what's great about the downtown, I think one of the things is that's most evident is there's a real staccato with the lots. There aren't a lot of large lots. There's a lot of narrow lots that kind of stack. And when you walk along the street, it's that constant churn of different facades and different signage that gives it a lot of life and makes it very pedestrian. So that's something that we want to preserve. And in this document, we have suggested that people that work in the historic downtown cannot do lot consolidation. In other words, they can buy multiple lots, but they can't build a single building across 2 or 3 or 4 lots. They have to build separate buildings. And in that way, that will help the scale and it'll help it preserve the downtown historic appearance. This district sees a little more height, 3 floors as a base, up to 4 floors with the bonus. And you might see commercial ground floor, which is what you see at the top right here, or at the top left here, or you might see a residential ground floor with a stoop. We provide options for both. The lot width gets a little bit wider, or I'm sorry, the lot width is a little bit smaller than the previous one. It's 124 feet. And then we've got quite a bit of depth as a lot of those downtown parcels have. And then finally in the T5 zone, this is this is the densest zone in terms of what can be built. It makes the most sense because we're talking about Marin Country Mart. We're talking about around the ferry and the train, easy access to the highways, great public transit. This is a place where people could get away with fewer cars, hopefully, and survive without maybe even a car at all. And here we're looking to see buildings of some height here, a base maximum of 5 floors and 7 up to a bonus. And I think one of the reasons that will work is there's a lot of hills in the background, and there's actually pretty substantial buildings behind Marin Country Mart with quite a bit of height. And I think that will all blend together well. And it provides you that, it helps you meet the housing element numbers in terms of trying to provide enough units for the city moving forward. So I wanted to walk through an example, and it was suggested we look at the grocery store at 560 Magnolia that's gone out. Now, I know that this particular lot is broken up into a handful of different parcels and ownership. For the purposes of this demonstration, we are just going to look at the parcel as one parcel for the whole block. And we just want to walk you through how a developer would pick this up. So they take their site and they would look on the zoning map and they would determine what zone they're in. In this case, they're in a T4 SMS zone. This is coming out of the downtown on Magnolia where Doherty is. And then you would look at the size of the parcel to understand how many divisions you need, and you would look at the frontage. And you can see here on the right side, the primary frontage. The way that this works is you take the primary frontage, and that frontage is divided into design sites based on the width. This is an especially large site for this area, 3.2 acres and 440 feet on one side and 350 on another. But it poses a good example to help explain how the design site system works. So the idea here is that since this site is so large, you would need to break it down into a handful of design sites that are no more than 150 feet in width. And in doing so, it will help preserve the scale of the buildings that come out of the downtown. We don't need this type of breaking up to such small bits when we get to the T5 around the Marin Country Mart, but you're coming up Magnolia, and we felt that, this zone in particular, you don't want to see a huge project. You want to see something that's a little more sensible, something that fits, that feels it's in the same family with the downtown. So in this case, we've broken it into 4 different design sites. You can see the yellow frontage is a line between each one of these 2 design sites. And then once you've broken your design sites and you start laying the building out, you have to look at what your floor height requirement is. And we have 3 to 4 floors for this particular zone. We do provide provisions for how to handle setbacks in a way that works with development in terms of development widths and the way that wood framing is done. And you can make a decision about whether you're going to have a commercial ground floor or a residential ground floor. And then you'll move to setbacks, which is very typical with all zoning. We have setbacks that are applied based on the primary frontage and the secondary frontage and the rear frontage and the interior frontage. If you have any encroachments, canopies, you have bay windows, stairs, ramps, there's rules to follow on that. And then when you get to parking, we have parking standards built into this, and then you can figure out how much you need to park. The one caveat to that is obviously parking can be waived under certain circumstances when you provide enough affordable housing. And then you get to the fun part, you get to massing. So, with all the information you have in hand in terms of setbacks, you sit down and you start working out what the building sizes can be. And the maximum width of buildings in this zone within a single design site is 120 feet. And then we have a 65-foot max depth. And that is related to a typical double-loaded residential wood frame building. We allow wings to occur. You can see that you can orient buildings differently on different frontages. And then once you've formed your buildings, you work through where the parking goes, if you want any accessory buildings. And then there are particular requirements for providing shared open space. In this zone, 50 square feet minimum for every 1,000 square feet of building area or of design site. And then we have open space specific to the units, which can be achieved in a couple of different ways. So then the outcome here in this particular project is we got a residential building with 2 levels over retail, another solely residential building here, and then some townhouses with a common area road that connects back through. Now, this is certainly by no means the only approach or even necessarily the best approach for dealing with this site, but this demonstrates how a developer could look at this and use the standards to figure out what their requirements are. And then once you've laid out your site, you look at the way that it confronts the street. So there are frontage requirements, or there's frontage types that we've preserved from the Marin County odds that Opticos created. We've got the porch and the dooryard and the stoop. These are not design styles. They're just ways that buildings can confront the street, and they're traditional. And we felt they fit well with the city of Larkspur and the built form that's there today. And then finally, you get to materials in terms of what's allowed. The one caveat here is, with these objective guidelines, we need to provide materials that can work for high-end buildings, but also enough material breadth that they can work for affordable housing. Some people don't like vinyl windows, but in affordable housing, that might be the best way to get there. So we have to make some compromises there in terms of what's allowed. But then we have rules included with this on how materials must be applied. For instance, you can't change materials at a corner that comes out. You can only do it on an inward corner. is on an outward corner, it just would not look like traditional construction. It would look like a thin application. So then finally, we wanted to look at just 3 case studies that we went through of existing buildings just to show whether they're compliant or non-compliant, and what they could change, you know, if they were brought today. Obviously, if these odds are instituted, no existing building is required to change any aspect or do anything. We're just looking at these as it relates to future development. So this building, which is on 30 Locust Avenue, this is a very typical building of that sort of 60s era, where you have a ground floor of parking, and then you've got the units above it. And then the short end sits on the street. So there are aspects of this building that are compliant. You know, it meets the design site size and the building height and the setbacks and the encroachments. But where it's not compliant is really how it fronts the street. We're not allowing parking to come up to the public way. You have to have at least a 30-foot buffer there. There's no glass or anything on the ground floor. This particular building does not observe the correct or a sufficient enough rear setback. There's not the shared open space that's necessary. So there's a number of things that don't work with this if it was submitted today. And I think if it was submitted and then it used these rules, I think you would end up with a better project. There are things about this that we worked on with the odds, you know, and going through this study and in adjusting the amount of glazing that might be necessary, and sort of activity at the ground floor, because of parking. Obviously, we want an active ground floor use. The next one is 285 Magnolia, and this is a cool little project. This is one you approved some years ago. It's a very interesting one because it has this sort of shop house concept where you have the retail at the ground floor. You know, this is compliant in a lot of ways in terms of design site size and the building height and the setbacks is compliant and the mass and length. The retail is a little too low. I think the retail on this is actually 9 feet. So that is one issue. We've tried to get more retail just so you have a better chance that the retail space will not remain empty. Because I think that's the biggest blight for these types of things, is that you just end up with a papered over retail space. And also the way that the rear units are used, there's some debate about whether that would be counted as an accessory building or not. Typically under accessory buildings in our odds, we make them a little bit smaller than the primary buildings on the street. That's another thing that we have been trying to sort through, sort of what the best of approach is, because I think we agree that this is a good project, you know, and we would want an opportunity for a developer possibly to do something similar to this in the future. And then the last one I want to look at is 1700 4th Street in San Rafael. We want to look at this one as it relates to potential guidelines for your downtown if you were to have a building. You know, this is a building on 4th and G. It comes up to the front and it addresses the street very well. It has a design site that's very compliant in the building height. All the setbacks meet and the encroachment. It doesn't have as much glazing on the ground floor. And I think that's another thing which we're kind of kicking around about whether 75 is too much or whether that should come down. This doesn't have a substantial rear setback. And there's a parking entrance on the primary frontage. We want that to come around the side as much as possible. And it doesn't seem like they have the same amount of, or the adequate number of private open space available. So I think these 3 kind of illustrate what's successful and what's not with some of these buildings. And I think, you know, a lot of people would probably agree that this is a building that it would probably look pretty good in downtown Larkspur, and understanding why it works with the odds and what aspects would be changed versus a building, you know, like this that's a little bit older, that, you know, people would want a different facade on the street. So with that, I didn't want to go any further. That's what I wanted to run through with you. And then I just wanted to get your comments.
I wanted to add too that staff is recommending a couple of pages of modifications to the standards. Some of them are really minor items. One of them is a recommendation from the Heritage Board, and they had recommended that the city require projects that had a historic structure to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards, and that the Heritage Board review the project to make sure that it complies with the Secretary of Interior standards, and that during that review, the city historic consultant could advise them as to whether or not the project complies or not. And then the other recommendation that staff had that was, or is just to be on the safe side, is to include protections for Native American historical resources. So we're recommending some language that's taken out of state law regarding protection of sites and reporting any accidental discoveries. And then there's a section that just talks about the regulations in Title 18, which is our current zoning chapter, that should continue to apply to different aspects of a project, just to make it clear that those rules aren't waived in the new Title 20. And then there's just some typos and numbering that needs to be corrected for the final version. So you could add to this list or remove things from this list, but we would be recommending that you recommend that the city council include those changes. And then if you were to recommend approval with those changes, the consultants could revise the draft before it goes to the city council. We're happy to answer any questions. It might be just easier to do that because this is a lot of material and you could just focus on the issues that you might have.
Well, thank you very much for the staff report and also for the presentation by Mr. Masterson. I think that's his name. So thank you. That was very informative and very helpful. I had some questions, but I wanted to see if the commission had questions too. Nothing from you. You have a few post-it notes, I see, and some notes, and I saw you have a few. Well, I guess I had called Elise earlier, and my main question was whether we could take this and just limit this to just a portion of the city. So maybe just the sites that were up in the housing element or something specific. So it wouldn't apply to everything and we could fall back on the existing code for everything else that applied to multifamily. However, I must say, since our conversation, I was actually quite impressed with the presentation. But I still sort of stand by that. If that's something that we want to talk about and whether we sort of limit these specific objective design standards to just a very limited portion of the city. Because the one thing that concerned me about what I heard tonight was, even though when we looked at those three projects, I can see how the projects could be very well done with the objective design standards that were presented. They could also not be very well done. You could produce a very unattractive project that conformed with what's in this proposal. So it is no guarantee that we would have a suitable project just because we're following these standards that are in here.
That's true.
Right. So it was interesting, the three projects that were presented, that was a very effective in looking at those, but it doesn't mean that's what a developer would come up with. They could come up with something very simple and not very attractive. So until we look at this further, whether we want to just limit it to one particular area. Liam, you had something to use.
Are you talking about limiting to one particular area temporarily while we have some more discussion? Or because I feel like if we, from my understanding, if we limit it to a specific area and other areas of the city do not have objective design standards, then we could be putting ourselves in the same situation that we were in with Magnolia Village, where we don't have objective design standards in place when they apply for a development permit, and our hands are tied and we can't do anything, you know, unless I'm misunderstanding that.
That's correct. So if they're not applicable to a site, then you would just rely on our current standards, and there are few current standards.
But are our current standards stronger than what would be in here? Like, do we have more discretion, I guess is what I'm sort of saying, than what we would do if we had to comply with what's in this new proposal, this new Title 20?
There's a lot coverage limit that isn't really applicable in this new standard. The parking in certain areas might be more restrictive, but as the consultant said, parking is, I wouldn't be worried about parking because anyone could ask for a waiver to that under all the state laws. You wouldn't have the requirements for certain kinds of stoops and like the part that is specific is requiring some type of treatment at the front and maybe window, like percentage of windows. You wouldn't have, it would miss some of the details. But it might allow more mass than what would be allowed under the current lot coverage and floor area standards.
I see. Okay.
And I guess the other thing that happens with the objective design standards is if once you introduce low and moderate income housing, you have more abilities to be objective from the developer standpoint, but not from how you can control the situation.
For example, like 2 stories, our height limit is 2 stories in almost every single district. And this allows for 3 to 4 stories and up to 7 stories in some districts. And that's one that definitely, I think, would be requested just to be waived by any other project. So we couldn't necessarily apply the current standards we have depending on how many units are allowed on that site.
But wouldn't it allow us, I mean, given what we saw in the Magnolia project, where there was so much pushback from the community, do we have a stronger ability to support the community with or without these new objective standards? I guess that's what I'm.
Yeah, well, and I think maybe in some sense we do.
I think we do in the sense that you have the zones, the various T3, different zones allow different building types. And that's what that other map was that was up before. But there are areas where potentially you could have a 5 or more story building.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not generally, at least my understanding, it wouldn't be something that would appear in the historic district, for instance.
So do we lose all control if we go with these objective standards?
We lose a lot of control, but
right.
they're really, as far as I can understand, and being on this committee, the committee was to me a frustrating process because you're mandated. So many different things are required, and this actually gives probably the best opportunity in many ways to have some control over what's going on. But I don't, until somebody comes up with a project,
we don't really know.
We don't really know.
I just wondered that rather than just blindly go into this and just say yes straight away, whether we have some ability to push back on what the state is doing to us.
You can have more restrictive standards, and that's the county book, which I have, it's not this thick as a single page, it's only half that, is definitely more specific as to these are the building types that you can build. I'm happy to share it. And I've highlighted the page. It's more specific as they went and looked at all the building types that are around, like the styles of buildings, and it's very specific to certain. You could build certain types of buildings. Those certain buildings have to meet certain size requirements, and the windows have to be a certain way so that like a Victorian building looks like a Victorian building, doesn't have a horizontal windows, but it has vertical windows. So it goes into much more, and then overhangs have to be a certain depth. You could be much more specific, and that would be a little more guaranteed because they have to build a building that looks like something that's in that guideline.
So this was removed?
So the parts are about specific building types and materials that go with those building types was eliminated just to allow architects more flexibility.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit to that. I mean, I think if you force developers in SB 35 instances to choose between a Tudor or a Craftsman building, they will not do it well. there is no real way to legislate against bad design. You hope that people have the best intentions, but even the most restrictive guidelines, you will get cheap materials and a poor facsimile of, let's say, a Tudor building if someone were to choose that. In terms of the exposure of the city, you know, if you only apply the odds to certain sites, anyone that were to use SB 35 or SB 330 and come with a multifamily development proposal for another site, essentially would have builder's remedy. I mean, there wouldn't be enough substantive existing code to give you the protection. Now, a developer can come to you and does not need to use the odds. They can go through a discretionary review process like you traditionally have. That's their choice. But the state through SB 35 wanted to provide an avenue to help increase the potential for multifamily and affordable housing. And that the way that they could do it was by eliminating discretionary review.
The one additional thing I'll chime in on, because we talked about this pretty extensively, is when you prescribe a specific style with 4 pages of specific details, you really just get one idea, and it's a very superficial idea about that architecture or period of architecture. And, specifically to Victorian or arts and crafts, you'll find 300-400 page books that show a rich diversity of detailing and expressions that are not prescribed in those very specific documents. And the city of Richmond had a great debate when they were going through this document, or it was a similar document where they tried to say what was California modern and define the mid-century. And there was an architect on the committee that just tore apart the Optico standards, saying this is not good detailing. So I think in a certain way, if you get over prescriptive from a planning perspective, you actually shut down or close the door to some very good architecture. So that's kind of the line we're trying to draw. We require that the scale, the size, the bulk, the articulation in terms of building mass is governed. But then we don't prescribe that the window have this trim detail or this proportion or this style, which was part of what was in the Optico standards.
As your resident architect, you agree with that?
Yeah, I actually, I think the difficulty is the somewhat aggravating fact is we don't have a lot of control. And if somebody meets, my concern is if somebody meets the requirements for height, et cetera, they can do a pretty awful building. They can also do a really nice building. But we can't necessarily direct them. I think Magnolia Village, we were able to make some changes to that I think will make it a better building, but not a lot. And we couldn't enforce having guest parking, for instance, on the site, and that's unfortunate because that spills into the neighborhood, and I don't know how you get around that. But I actually think that what they've done with what the team here has done is gone through this pretty carefully, and it has set it up probably as well as you can given what the situation is. That was my take, and that was our committee's take.
I've got kind of a general question. I'm not sure if it's who it's best directed at, but so I'm recalling back to when we heard the Magnolia Village project, and they had because they were providing 20% affordable or greater affordable housing, they were entitled to use waivers and other measures to sort of get around or not comply with the city code. So with these objective design standards, I guess just so I'm clear on how they're going to be applied, are those waivers and exemptions
still apply?
Still apply.
Right.
So okay.
for that builder's remedy, I mean, can we, let's say we don't make this site specific and we agree to this, can we take out the section, like agree to all of it, but just remove the section that talks about the affordable housing and kind of that builder's remedy bit, and just exclude it and just see what happens?
And I don't know which section you're referring to.
Oh, it's the findings and decisions.
Oh, so I think that's the Housing Accountability Act.
Yeah, which I know we are
Right.
bound by state law to comply with.
We would have to follow it, even if it wasn't in this document, we would still have to follow it. It's just set forth here to help applicants understand the process for considering the application and what findings would be made. But
Mhm.
if you could recommend taking it out, the city still has to comply with it.
That's the issue.
I know, yeah, I do. I'm just wondering if there was, I don't know. I guess I don't like it. I guess that's what it comes down to. I don't like that we have to do this, and
You are not alone.
and I know we're not alone. And I hate to be in a situation where we just do nothing and just say, okay, I really appreciate the work that's been done in this presentation here and in what's been proposed. And I can see, actually I'm very impressed by it. And I'm trying to push back as much as I can. And I just wondered if we had any ability to not make the recommendation to city council. And again, I'm going to defer to my commissioners. They may completely disagree with me, but and then if the city council wants to agree, they can agree. But it's just, maybe this is more for personal sake of mine, that I don't really care to just have to go into this so quickly and have to live with this. And I don't. So here's a better question: what is everyone else doing? What are all the other cities? Are they all complied?
Corte Madera, I think, was one of the first to adopt, and they adopted the county standard, but didn't include the architectural, like the architectural styles were adopted as like a guideline that people could follow, but wasn't required. But I think the remainder of the document was fairly similar. San Anselmo too adopted the county document, very similar to what the county proposed. The county of Marin adopted the county toolkit as a form-based code, and others are still working on it. I think Tiburon is still considering it. Belvedere adopted it, the toolkit, as the county proposed it. Fairfax, I don't believe has done much other, although David Masterson and Ryan Call had prepared a draft for them. And then I think Sausalito still hasn't adopted theirs yet either. So there's a mix. Some have just used the toolkit primarily, and some have customized it a little.
I see. Okay.
Mill Valley did not want to adopt it, and they needed to comply with that grant too. So they, I think, have adopted a resolution to use them as guidelines.
Oh, I see. Do you have any comments before you go? I was just expressing I don't like that we're being bullied into this by the state.
I don't like being bullied into anything. The problem is I don't know how much, we have a say in it, do we?
Right. Not really, but my question was really, what I was posing was, how much can we push back, and can we not make these recommendations? I'm impressed with the report that was given. I'm impressed with all of this. It's very well done.
Did you guys prepare this large book? Is that your project? Is this your doing, or is this your doing?
Or Optico's design prepared that county toolkit.
It's really well done. But it doesn't mean I have to like it.
Yeah. So I think, yeah. But I'm the same way. It is very, very well done, and I'm impressed by it, but I hate that we're being steamrolled into this, and I'm curious to know what ways we have to push back, if at all. And
well, from what I understand, we don't. But that's, just like the project on North Magnolia,
right?
We can just,
Got a few things, but not much.
Not much.
Yeah, and if we did adopt this, would it tie our hands even further? That's the piece I was curious about. Is will that tie our hands? Yeah.
Do we have a choice to say no? I mean, if we say no, what are the consequences? I mean, is it like too bad? I don't know.
It seems like, I mean, this is just my take. I'm not like a professional on this, but it seems like if we don't adopt anything, then it's going to happen anyway, and we won't have, the porches and the lot frontages that we, while it doesn't guarantee a good design, it's better than what it could be without it. I mean,
Is that correct?
Is that?
Or not, or do we just have, or does it revert back to the rules under Title 18?
No, I think, well, I guess I'm not entirely clear as to what would result from them, but they, like, so a lot of the setbacks are similar, the heights are increased. So it allows for taller buildings, larger buildings than what's allowed under general standards. But as we've mentioned, the housing developers can ask for waivers.
When just wait, do you want to do it? I mean, do you want to say anything? Or do you,
No,
I mean, in terms of,
do you want to abstain? I think I'll abstain, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, about what we're going to eventually decide.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
All right, so we're one down, so we're just the three of us. So sorry, yeah, go ahead.
It allows for taller buildings and in some cases with different setbacks, more stories, but as we've learned with the Magnolia project, even our current existing rules they could just ask for waivers of all the standards. So I don't know that it makes much of a difference one way or the other, because ultimately they can build what they need to build in order to do the density that we're allowing on the site. So if we have a 2-story limit, you saw it was 4 feet and over 50 feet tall. Maybe if we had these standards in place, they would be a little more compliant. And maybe it would have come in with a different project in the first place.
We have done a system that scales it better than what was provided in Opticos. I mean, if you do have a large site in most of these zones, you do have to break it up into smaller sites and smaller buildings, you know. I think if it's not adopted, then you basically are opened up to builder's remedy, which would let, you know, basically anyone come in and submit something and claim that there aren't standards to follow, and therefore they can kind of build whatever.
Builder's remedy is an actual process, a legal process,
right,
which is in place today, but as soon as we get our housing element adopted, it wouldn't apply, but it would be you'd just be seeing the same process as we saw with the Magnolia Village project. They'd be able to ask for waivers to standards.
And I think that was our take on the housing element committee, was that actually this may give the best opportunity to get the best result. If you have somebody who's just going to come in and make as much money as they can, this won't necessarily stop them. But nothing else would either.
And how,
given the state situation,
right? And how does it help if we did what Mill Valley did, which you said they adopted this as guidelines?
They adopted as guidelines, which is not going to help. So their regular standards are in place, and ultimately the developers wouldn't have to follow them. But they're just, and that's, they might be revisiting them later, but they're ultimately the developers wouldn't have to comply if they're just a guideline.
And can we, if we did adopt this, can we add language in here that allows or at least put something in here? And I know this isn't permitted by the state, but can we put something in here that allows us to impose reasonable conditions, I mean, that's really it, reasonable conditions for each and every project?
Yes. Yeah, so you could have conditions of approval for projects.
We can do that. But that's not already in here, right? All we can do is just say something about health and safety if it's.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked for that specific to see if it's actually in there, but it would, just to be on the safe side, if you want to do that, you could just make a recommendation that it includes something that allows you to impose conditions of approval.
So at least then, should we have another Magnolia project, we can impose that, and it's up to a developer then to push back on us and say, you don't have the right to do that. So it puts the onus on the developer. At least we have an opportunity to say something and give advice on a particular project. I'm just throwing out ideas here.
Yeah, I like that idea. I'm just not sure if it would work.
And it might not, but at least it allows, because otherwise kind of what's the point of having a commission? It's like, at least it allows us to have a say, and a developer hopefully would want to work with the community and the commission if a developer doesn't want to do that, I guess they would argue and bring lawyers in and say we don't need to.
I guess in a way we had that opportunity on Magnolia Village in the sense that we had 5 meetings we could have used.
But that
and let them come back and see if they would adhere to some whatever directions we're trying to give them. But we did get certain things done, lowering floors and pushing the mezzanine back, and maybe that's, I don't know.
I mean, I feel with Magnolia, that was sort of, at least in my personal experience, my first time dealing with the rules. So I'm learning from that as to maybe what we could do different next time. What do you think? I mean, I would love to put something in here that just at least gives us something later on, but.
And we haven't taken any public comments yet too.
Yeah.
Let me remind you.
That's true, actually. Good point. Yeah. Do we have any, let me see if there's any more actual questions for staff on here, which is what I was going through.
Do you have any more?
I mean, I couldn't believe I found a typo, which I think I was a bit shocked at myself, which I think I conveyed earlier. So you have that.
Oh, I found something, I think it's on page 85 in section E2. It says parking area surfacing materials shall consist of the following materials in compliance with the City of Larkspur Fire Department requirements, but then there's no following materials. So I don't know if that was just something I stumbled upon, I guess, while I was reading it.
There are references to road standards as something we're trying to address currently, because the City of Larkspur does not currently have road standards. So the intent was for the document to refer back to existing road standards as Octagos wrote it, but you don't have it. So we're working on that.
All right, that makes sense.
Do you have any questions for staff or for the consultants?
No.
No, okay.
I think we should let the
public speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to continue with your question?
I guess I just had one more. It's on page 88 and it's number 4E. It says, I'm a civil engineer doing soil stuff, so I read the grading part. It says grading beyond the building pads and required access drives shall not happen. It seems like sometimes on a hillside site, you need to grade beyond the building pad to create the building pad. I mean, I guess if you can't physically create a building pad, somebody's going to complain about that, but.
Yeah, or they would ask for a waiver.
Ask for a waiver.
Right.
That was just another thing I noticed, I guess, but that's all that I.
Do we need to make that correction or adjust that?
I think that got struck in the latest version.
Oh, okay.
Shall not result in grading beyond the building pad. And Liam was saying, well, actually, we do need grading beyond the building pad.
I mean, it could be like no excessive grading beyond or something, but you do have to go beyond the actual pad itself to create a slope.
And if you had a number, that would be an objective standard.
I mean, I don't. It depends on the slope. Like
standard.
we usually recommend like a 2-to-1 slope. So if you're going down, if you're coming up 3 feet, you have to go out 6 feet. So it's like the number depends on
the
slope and what you're trying to make.
Stuff, really.
Yeah, it is. It is. I just saw shall not do that. That sounds objective, I guess.
I mean, we could.
Yeah, we can correct that in the next draft.
All right. Thank you. Any more? Okay. Okay, I'll come back then to what I was referring to earlier, because you made a good point. We should hear from the public. Do we have anyone, Alex, in the public that'd like to speak?
Yes, the first hand up is Kevin Carroll.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm just curious, my understanding that the whole point of the objective design standards was to give us more control over SB 35 builder's remedy. And so I'm just curious, since Magnolia Village is now a done deal, and I assume is proceeding ahead, how would these standards have applied to that particular project? Would it be a good idea to look back and see how it might have been different if we'd had these in place? And what difference that would have made. And I don't know, my second one is a proposal that was before the Heritage Preservation Board last week, was modifications to 472 Magnolia, which included adding multiple housing units at one point, though I think that's been pared down. How these standards would apply to that project if they were passed. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Are you interested in hearing a response to that? Yeah.
Your response first?
Yeah, I think if the consultants could.
Maybe on Magnolia for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think David Masterson had looked at the Magnolia project, so he might be able, it's a very different, the zone that it's in requires very different style buildings and setbacks, I think, than what was proposed.
Yeah, we haven't looked at it as it relates to the odds. I'd have to look back at the district, whether it would allow the 4 floors. I never saw the final version of Magnolia. I saw some interim version. But I'm not sure that the 4th floor would be allowed, but I'd have to go back and check on that.
Yeah, the zone that it's in is like a residential zone. And so the building characteristics are more for, I would say lower density, but sort of lower density residential structures.
Right. I think that's a 2.5 to 3 floor zone.
What would that fall into? TN4? T4? Or?
I believe it's in T4SN.
Before saying, okay, so that.
And because that project had 20% affordable, if I remember right, would we have, I mean, you may be speculating at this point, but would we have had a material change in how the project could be sort of regulated, or could we have feasibly ended up with the same product at the end because they were able to use waivers and concessions per state law? That's not a Larkspur thing.
But so like the standards don't have any sort of minimum for plate heights. So they could have proposed what they were proposing. The height limit, there would have been a height limit, but they could have asked for a waiver of that.
So what's the point?
I think the front setback is actually larger than what they proposed. The front setback, let's see. I mean, but in the end, if they couldn't build 16 units at the size they wanted, they would have asked for waivers to all the standards.
So even if we approve this Title 20 with the objective standards, a developer could still come in and request the waivers. As long as they have the affordable housing, they could come in and request these specific waivers and build a project that they want to build and ignore the objective standards.
It's true. The only thing that the city could do is to re-examine the densities in these different districts to make sure that a large unit could be built in that zone. So let's say the density allowed on Magnolia was only 6 units. Then we probably could say, yes, you should be able to get 6 large units in with this residential building form, and they would have less to push us with. But as long as we have higher densities, like the 21 units, they can ask for a lot of waivers to get more units. So the building types and what we're allowing for development really has to also conform to what kind of density we're allowing. And then obviously they're going to want to have larger units to make their project pencil out. So that's going to be a consideration for them too. So, but it's true. If it didn't work out for them, they could ask for just waivers of these standards.
So, I mean, kind of what it sounds like to me, what we've been going around in circles about is for an affordable unit that's governed and not by any Larkspur objective or subjective standard, but by state law. And we don't seem to have too much control over that.
Even though they say we do.
But this would apply. So say somebody came in and wanted to build a market rate unit without the affordable component.
Yeah, you would have more control over a market rate project. That's true.
Because currently a market rate.
The density bonus waivers and concessions wouldn't apply to a market rate project. The Housing Accountability Act would, so you couldn't preclude probably development. So we still want to make sure that the standards would allow the density that we're allowing in each of the districts, so that they don't have to ask for waivers to build. And we can't say, oh, you can only build a house, but we're saying that you could build 21 units an acre there. And then currently the city's not subject to SB 35 because we had built an adequate number of units in the last cycle. So I would expect in the future, they periodically review how the city's doing, meeting its regional housing need. And since our number is so high now, unless we get a lot of projects soon, we probably will be subject to SB 35 in the future again, but at the moment we're not subject to SB 35.
So will that mean that this Title 20 won't come into effect until we're subject to SB?
No, it just will apply to the other projects. People have been mentioning SB 35 and Mr. Carroll asked about it, but it still applies to the Housing Accountability Act projects and the density bonus projects and every other multifamily project that would, because we could only apply objective standards to multifamily projects. Okay. Or we can't deny them based on a subjective standard. Okay.
So this would be, sounds like more important at some point in the future, whenever we get reevaluated for SB 35.
Right, definitely. And also if you're proposing to eliminate discretion as part of the housing element process, because SB 35 essentially, it takes away your discretion. And we're proposing in the draft housing element too, to have certain sites where no discretion would be applied. Someone would just come in with a building permit as long as they met these rules. So it's just, we have to be more careful when we're taking away discretion. And that sort of leads to the other question that Councilman Carroll had, was how this would apply on the Magnolia site. And in the downtown area, because it's a historic district, the city still has to apply the California Environmental Quality Act. And so there's discretion under that to make sure that the project isn't destroying a historic structure, and that anything that's rebuilding in the historic district doesn't destroy the historic downtown district. So there's a little more protection just in downtown because of the historic designations in the historic district.
Right. Okay, and you've also made the amendment as well.
Right, just to make it clear.
To clarify that.
Yeah, and that would also cover any other site around that we might not know is historic or maybe not listed.
So to close that question from Kevin Carroll out, then the consultants will come back with some information about how it would have changed, or I guess Magnolia, or are we not expecting?
No, I mean, if they have time, it might be a good thing to have information on before we get to the city council hearing, just because I think the same question will come up. But
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I could take a look at those parameters too.
Thank you.
They don't have time to do that before next week.
Do we have any other comments or questions? And we do? Yeah. Should we just move on to the next?
Okay. The next hand up is a phone number ending in 1402.
James Holmes, Larkspur. This is a very complex document. It's a little hard to understand even by a layman who's able to read plans. The experts seem to have created a document they need an expert to understand. I suspect that most citizens are unaware of what's going on and might be surprised and concerned if they did know. However, the response to the North Larkspur debacle gives an idea of how they do respond when they see the result. That leads to my first question, which has already been touched on to a certain extent, and I would phrase it to say, does this plan reflect any lessons learned as a result of that North Larkspur debacle? I know that the document was prepared mostly before that unpleasant introduction, and I do think we should go back and see what lessons are learned and what we can put in the plan specifically to avoid the problems that we had there. A second question, why include SB 35 provisions in the plan if SB 35 doesn't apply to Larkspur, as the staff report stated? You know, why trouble till trouble troubles us? I admit I didn't wasn't able to fully study the all-important zone map on page 27, but at a minimum, number one, it should be larger. Number two, it should use contrasting primary colors like red, green, blue, and yellow, and orange for the zones rather than shades of yellow and gold. Number three, I request using one or two words to identify the zones, not those various letters and numbers. Sometimes these are non-substantive, but sometimes format enhances clarity. And finally, although it's been said that there are only 4 categories for Larkspur, or 4 zones for Larkspur, I saw 5 categories and colors on the map itself. Most illustrations are not drawn from Larkspur, which is sort of disquieting in terms of the objective of reflecting Larkspur's specific character. So I think that wherever we can get an illustration from Larkspur, we should. I strongly support the Heritage Board's recommendation, which is described on the staff in the staff report on page 3 and attachment 4. This is essential. For clarity, I'd like to know when exactly these standards would apply in single-family residential areas. I think I've read somewhere that single-family lots can be divided, and then 2 ADUs can be added or auxiliary units of some sort can be added to each. So I'd really like to know specifically how this fits in single-family lots. And finally, and the major issue which has been touched on is, does this go beyond what state law requires? Are we giving up more than state law requires? I don't think we should. Especially in this regard, I'm concerned about the deletion of architectural standards. Now, I just read the staff report, and it said, it's on page 3, architectural standards addressed building, massing, and composition, openings, and exterior elements, with added standards related to architectural styles, and then it says something about expressions tailored to individual jurisdictions. And then in the section relating to Larkspur, it said elimination of toolkit architectural style requirements and the corresponding massing and composition requirements. And it's particularly the massing and composition requirements which I focused on. It then goes on to say the Larkspur odds allows, interesting acronym, the odds allows developers more flexibility than the original toolkit. So it does seem like we are giving up something. Now, is this wise? I understand. I mean, do we think good design automatically happens on the first draft? I think Larkspur's experience is that almost every good multi-family structure is the result of careful design review. Now, if we can't do that, as it seems we can't, is no architectural standards really the next best thing? It seems like there are 3 levels of review. One is, and the best level is design review plus flexibility. If we don't have that, then the next level down, and it is down, but it's there, is prescriptive standards. And then the next level down from prescriptive standards is laissez-faire, and I'm afraid this leans too far toward laissez-faire, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. Between prescriptive and laissez-faire, it may be that some measure of prescriptive is the lesser of two evils. And, you know, it seemed to me that just as a practical matter, we'd want to start strict and then we could loosen later rather than start loose and then maybe tighten up if after we don't like what we first get, but we're stuck with it. And then also as a practical matter, if a substantial number of the cities do have architectural standards, doesn't that increase the possibility that the developers will come with their cheap projects to Larkspur? So I really think we ought to maybe look at the possibility of at least some of those architectural standards, specifically as they relate to massing and composition. And then finally, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was just I should have reminded everyone at the beginning to try and limit your comments to 3 minutes. We do want to hear your comments, Mr. Holmes, so please continue, but if you could.
Finally, one point, I looked at the design, I looked at the plans regarding the shopping center, and they showed just giant buildings real high. And I'm also concerned about the 45-foot reference. There were 45 references to 45 feet. And additionally, I remember reading in the EIR for the housing element that aesthetics were not a substantial problem because of the 25-foot limit in the downtown limit. But here now we don't have a 25-foot limit, so that suggests that the EIR's comments about the housing element are not accurate. So in any event, those are my comments, and I do think maybe we need just a bit more control that we have and less laissez-faire. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Do we want to address any of his comments, or should we just move on to the next comment and come back to it?
Let's
move on.
all the comments.
Yeah. Okay. Any more comments in the public? That was it? That was the last one? Okay, thank you. I do want to say, actually, I do think some of his comments maybe could be incorporated, especially some simple ones like the colors. I mean, the map is very pretty and autumnal, but maybe some primary colors would be helpful. And maybe the consultants could address the 4, because they did say there was 4 zones, and you're right, there are 5 zones mentioned here on the map. I will say I understand the heritage requirements are already being proposed as a change, so I think that's covered. And maybe they could address the single family, how it applies to single family homes, which I think is T3, but
yeah. So right now zones have been assigned to the single family zoning districts, but we don't allow multifamily housing in those districts. There's an exception, or there's a clarification that we're recommending, or modification of the document to be specific that the SB9 projects need to comply with the SB9 rules that are in Title 18. And that's the chapter that deals with subdivisions of single family lots. So you could allow SB9 subdivisions to meet these T3 standards if you wanted to be more generous. Those other standards are more restrictive. And then the benefit of having it in that district is if for some reason a project comes through where we have to ministerially approve it. For example, if someone was to propose an affordable unit that was deed restricted and we were somehow forced to approve that as a multifamily develop or under the Housing Accountability Act. So it's kind of a fallback in the event that we can't apply our other standards, that there'd be more standards in place to guide a project if we didn't have discretion. But for the most part, it just won't apply to the single family zoning districts because no multifamily is allowed in those districts.
But what about houses that are already multifamily that maybe you want to expand? Because I mean, I'm looking at this T3, which is the single family district, but aren't there already some houses in there that are built as original houses, but now have multiple units in them?
There are some, and it's gonna be difficult on how we're gonna apply these rules to existing structures.
And isn't there some ability to do lot splits and put 2 houses plus?
That's the SB9.
Yeah,
so
right.
if you have the recommendation that were in attachment 4, we were recommending that those SB9 units still follow the standards that you have for SB9 units in Title 18. So you have really restrictive standards on those right now, which could be loosened. And if you were to, you could reconsider that in the future and then have the T3 standards apply after that's studied more thoroughly too. And at least we'd have them in place. An alternative would be possibly just to leave the T3 standards in the document, but take the zones out of the map. So there's just no place where they apply, but that we have something in place if you ever needed to put them back in.
Or can we make it clear it doesn't apply though, if we keep it in?
Well, the title, the application chapter with that chart says it doesn't apply to single family. So
just to be clear, if a developer comes in and wants to build multi-unit project in any of these neighborhoods that are T3, so looking at this map here, that would be like Larkspur Marina or Palm Hill. They cannot do that.
Because multifamily is just not allowed in those districts.
So either they can't apply for the waivers or concessions or anything, they just cannot do that.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And then the last comment Mr. Holmes had was on the elimination of massing and composition. So are we losing control on that?
Well, as we just discussed previously, you either can go very restrictive and prescriptive as to or not. So it's a choice you'd have to make.
We talked about architectural design, but maybe massing and composition might.
But they have some massing standards. They're a little more general in terms of building length and width. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some massing standards. They're just not as prescriptive as the other ones.
I think the massing standards are actually quite specific in that they make you break down really large sites into smaller buildings. And I think that's something that Magnolia might have been forced to do. We're giving depth and length maximums for buildings. So I would say that these odds are more restrictive than the current zoning in terms of the multifamily massing. What we've chosen to remove simply is the style that you put on those masses, whether it's a Tudor style or a Craftsman or a modern style. Because the toolkit had, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 styles, but that's no assurance that they'll be done well.
No, I was going to say that I think he might have been referring to this Tudor and Victorian styles that are in that purple binder over there that we kind of talked about earlier as still not a guarantee that it's going to be a good looking project.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. So I guess it's just up to the commission to discuss what do we want to do today, right? Do we want to make a proposal today? Do we want to wait until we have more members here?
I wouldn't recommend waiting just because we need to get it to the city council. And if we don't get it to the city council, we potentially lose the grant fund. So if you can make a decision one way or the other, that would be really useful to staff.
Okay, we hear you. It's up for discussion now amongst us. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit already, so.
Well, I mean, I've gone through this before.
Yes.
And it's not magic, but it is, I think, sort of your best attempt to maintain some control. I mean, the problem, once you get waivers, it doesn't matter in any case. And but I think this gives people enough flexibility that they may not need or think they want to go that way, and still produce buildings that, they're in it to make some money. And I think it's a pretty intricate document, really.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're kind of in a similar situation as we were with Magnolia Village, where our options are to do nothing and have builders sort of do what they want, or to do something, which would be adopt all or part of this and sort of give some guidelines, and they still may be able to do whatever they want. But that's the state law, and that's not our role here to, I think, to be the arbiters of that. I mean, I think that's, you know, I think we should comply with the state law. And so I think having something in place that is, you know, at least a guideline for, say, market rate units, or a path for developers to, you know, come up with a design that we think works with Larkspur, without going the whole waivers and doing whatever they want route is probably a good thing. And in the end, the results may not change from what they would have if we had just done nothing, but it seems like it's an attempt to get a result, a more desirable result than we would have otherwise.
Thank you. Sorry to lengthen this, but I do have three more questions. Somewhere in here, I read that this was limited to urban areas, and I can't find it anymore.
Under SB 35, the parcel has to be, well, I could read you from the state law. It's a legal parcel. If the development has to be a legal parcel or parcels located in a city, if and only if the city boundaries include some portion of either an urbanized area or urban cluster as designated by the United States Census Bureau. That might have been the section, because SB 35 only applies to places that are urbanized areas or an urban cluster.
Does that limit the applicability of this then?
Well, so as I said, SB 35 isn't applied to us right now, and the Census Bureau eliminated the terms urbanized area and urban cluster late 2022. So I would argue that it doesn't apply to the city because those terms don't apply anymore. But my guess is the state would tell us that we're urban and we have to apply it anyway.
Got it.
But that would be an area where I would want more information.
Okay. And then a comment really was, I struggled to understand initially the first sentence of your recommendation in attachment 4. We said this FBC also applies to additions or modifications to structures previously approved under the provisions of this title.
Right. So the application section only is speaking about new construction. And so I thought it might be good to have an addition that also applies to any modifications to those new structures. So if something was built under this code, then any modifications they want to make to their building also have to comply with the code. Because it's not, otherwise it's not really clear what we would do if someone came in and asked to change something.
Yeah. So once you explained it to me, that made sense. But
we could have this or recommendation could be to reword that.
I'm gonna see what Brock and Liam, if it makes sense to you too, then it was attachment number 4, the first line. Attachment number, yeah, see that first line. Does that make sense? Does it?
No, I agree with you. It doesn't really make sense as written.
Maybe we could just reword that so it was just a little clearer then.
Probably because we haven't been meshed in this for the last year. I know sometimes when you're writing stuff, it makes perfect sense to you because you've been,
not to you.
been in it for a while.
Oftentimes it's happening. And then definitely we could even add in title 20. That would make it a little more clear too.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And we would recommend that your recommendations are also included.
Be included,
so
right?
To do that in any motion that we make tonight.
And then any additional ones, and I have a few notes of things you'd mentioned tonight.
Right. And then the only other additional thing, which again, I'm happy to be shot down by my commissioners, was whether we could build in some ability to add conditions in the code. So at least we have something we can point at. I'm fully understanding that a developer may point to the state that would override it. But if we could put it in here, maybe I'd sleep better at night. But
Conditions would you?
Well, we would just per project. So for example, here it says,
What page are you on?
I'm on page 13 of the actual title 20. Okay. So findings and decisions. So if the proposed, so once to be able to make our findings, if the proposed housing development complies with the general plan, the community development department may only deny the development or conditionally approve it at a lower density if you do sort of 1 and 2. So maybe we could say that the staff or planning commission, so we have a say as well. That was one thought I had. And secondly, yes, one condition could be a lower density, or any other conditions that we could impose.
Yeah, I think we may be limited to the conditions we can impose, but it would be good to have in here that staff or the planning commission could impose conditions on the project. And they could be, the ones that I would come to mind as just really easy ones are install the landscaping prior to project final, or make sure you have water district sign off. But if there might be other ones that would be
right.
If the planning commission might have other ideas.
Just look at it, it gives us a chance to at least have an input, have a say, and we can point to this provision to do that. And then do we need to require that there is a public hearing, or is that automatically included?
I think as drafted, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, it would just be a staff review since we're looking at it against objective standards. However, that's something that can be modified. You could have the review for objective standards be a planning commission review where staff's indicating how it complies with the standards. And then there could be some debate over whether or not it complies. That there might be members of the public that might have concerns that could be raised at that meeting, but you would be limited to just considering whether or not the project complies with the objective standards.
Is there some threshold that we could put in? Because we don't want everything to necessarily come to the planning commission, but we could say maybe at the discretion of staff, or
over 4 units or something.
Or
that's
over
a good
4
idea.
units.
Because that's a
bigger structure, objective standard.
Yeah. Could the consultants recommend something like if there's?
I guess I would just say that the intent of SB 35 and these laws is that the approval is ministerial. So I don't know, that might be a question to you, Elise, whether that language could be, whether we can get around.
For SB 35, you may not be able to do that, but I think for ones that aren't subject to SB 35, which probably will be the majority of them, you could still have a different process.
Yeah, David, I sort of understand that we're going up against state law here, and state law does override. I guess I'm just trying to, I fully understand that.
Yeah.
And
it would be ministerial in the sense that you're not using any discretion, even if it was you're making the ministerial decision. But there might be SB 35 might have timelines that would just make that hard to do.
There's time limits in SB 35 that I think has to be reviewed in a certain time limit and given either a thumbs up or thumbs down, essentially. But I don't know, maybe if that happened within the context of a planning commission meeting and you could meet that timeline, and it was just to review them for compliance, maybe that's a workaround.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. And if it doesn't work, we can always change it, right?
Yeah. Well, it gets crossed out anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Do we want to add a threshold for that? I understood it won't apply to SB 35 projects, but for non-SB 35 projects,
we could do that.
I'm not.
I guess I would say, if you could word it in planning commission review, like if possible, or as many instances as possible, just something so that we can make the city council version compliant, but we have flexibility.
I would suggest doing it. Like, I think someone suggested a threshold on number of units, because you probably don't want to have like duplex splits come in front of you guys.
Right.
So, I don't know whether that's, 4 or 10 or whatever, but.
Like 5 is when the density bonus law applies. So 5 is kind of a good breaking point for projects that will try to take advantage of exceptions and waivers and things like that.
That feels good. Okay, so at 5, it goes to a public hearing, but conditions can be imposed by the staff or planning commission.
I think we don't have, there was one reference to the missing road standards, so correct the references to any missing road standards.
Okay.
And then there was the issue of the grading on page 88, which I don't know if they're.
Are we taking this opportunity to go through what we're asking to be changed, or do you need us to make a motion and then go through it again and list out the changes? How best do you want us to handle this?
Yeah, you could try it with a motion. I just don't want you to forget anything.
Yeah, we better
and the colors and the map.
On you.
Yeah, well, that's why I was thinking, if you go through them, if I have a list, then I could help you make the motion.
Oh,
but was there a change to the grading page that you wanted to make, or just have it re-examined?
I would just say
allow grading beyond the building footprint.
Yeah, re-examined to maybe, I don't know, meet the, I think I understand the intent of this, but may not be practical, I guess.
It needs to be a workable project, right? That's what it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's like all these other things where we can say whatever we want to say in here, and the project is gonna do what they have to do to get it built. But
yeah, I mean, the intent there, I think, is that they don't want a huge regrade of a project. They want to try to
preserve
the natural environment where
right, which makes a lot of sense.
Obviously, there's certain situations where that won't be possible. So, you know, the interpretation of that.
So maybe we just leave it up to staff.
I think it, yeah, that's
just leave it up to staff. I mean, that's okay with me. I trust your guys' judgment.
I mean, you don't necessarily have to grade. You can also retain.
Yep.
And end up with a area around a building too.
Yeah, that's true.
So
that's true.
Okay, so you want us to go through all the changes and then just make a motion that includes all what we just said?
Yeah,
or
you could do it in that sense. We
do it that way. Okay, so we said, okay, I'm going to start with the ones we just talked about, which was the in findings and decisions we refer to conditions can be made by community development department or planning commission, and either can make can impose conditions. And I guess I'll defer to the attorney then to put language in. Yeah. And are we keeping subsection B, and we can't delete that, can we? Subsection B.
About the Housing Accountability Act findings? No, I wouldn't recommend that.
I know, it's never going to work, is it?
The 5 or more units goes to public.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah.
5 or more units will require public hearing.
Should we say where possible to meet our deadlines?
Where possible would be great, just to have, we don't have to bring it back to you for if it's not possible.
Okay.
Okay.
Or have an emergency meeting.
Yeah.
All these meetings. And then there was the number of typos and corrections that you had recommended.
And then there's just to make sure that there's correct references to missing road standards, or somehow resolve references to missing road standards.
Right. And then a rewording of the first staff recommendation in attachment 4. The changing of the colors of the map.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
That's a great one, actually. Yeah. And the maybe a more descriptive, what else that he had in here? I think you just want, well, I don't know if that's necessary. I can't, where is the map?
This particular example does give the feeling of massive buildings just because of the way it's done. I mean, there's lots of ways to articulate it, but when you're looking at the floor plan, it looks pretty blocky.
Which page are you referring to?
57. So what are you suggesting? Something?
No, I think it's fine, but when I first saw this in one of our other meetings, I had the same reaction.
You had the same reaction, okay. Maybe it was eliminate or replace non-Larkspur pictures with Larkspur photographs. We want to do that. I don't know if that's necessary, but
probably not all of them, because there's some that like show the examples of a stoop that
exactly.
don't necessarily have to be
exactly
Larkspur specific.
And I think that was there anything else I've missed?
I think.
And then I think to answer Mr. Holmes's question about why the consultant said there were 4 zones and there are 5 zones on the map is because the 5th zone is the residential one. It doesn't apply. Is that the answer to that question?
Yeah, so we've revised that map. I think that's one older copy. We just have the 4 zones, and then there's the white zone, which is that's non-developable area. So, but that doesn't have a heading for it. So that has since been fixed. But yes.
So which of the 4 zones you have left?
The 4 zones that we have.
Sorry, what page is the map?
27.
Thank you.
The 4 zones we have are the T3SN, T4SN, T4SMS, and T5CMS. Those are the 5 zones.
I don't actually see T4CMS, that brown color on the maps.
Oh, so that's gone.
Just the legend got updated.
But something was in T4 SMS, which was
no CMS. Sorry,
CMS.
Yeah, no, that was left over from a previous version.
Oh, I see. Okay, that was a good catch then by Mr. Holmes. But that's a not. There isn't anything in that color or in the list here.
Oh yeah, good point.
Yeah.
I've got a general question, I guess, relating back to Mr. Holmes, not to interrupt our process here. This, I don't think will affect our discussion, but is this map available somewhere like in a GIS format where you can see where your parcel lies?
We could make that.
I
That
mean,
would be
maybe not
easy for us
GIS
to have as a layer, like can have it on our map.
Or something, just so people can like click on their parcel and see.
Or do it on our GIS. Yeah, that would be
whatever.
easy for staff to do even.
Because it is hard to see on
it is, yeah.
Individual.
Okay, so that's done. All right, and if there's nothing else, I think should we just make a motion?
Then the one thing that I wasn't sure now, do you want us to look at the grading to see if there's a way to modify it to make it possible when necessary to go exceed? Do you want us to reword that provision about the grading outside the envelope or not?
Well, I mean,
we could try to.
I can think we could look at different ways that
you could avoid it.
Might do it or not do it, just depending on what the site is. If you have a steep site, you're gonna have to create something around the building. I don't think it's real important, but
like you could recommend that we revisit it to see if there's a way to address the situations where it may be necessary in some sort of objective standard.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me.
Like I said, you can retain and do it that way too. So.
Yeah.
And then I would actually like to give an opportunity to David Masterson. Is there anything else that you would wanted to change in the document that's not in this first version? Because now would be the time if it's something, otherwise we may not be able to include it in the next one.
I marked up the annotated version of the document. I marked up one of the things, just to kind of discuss a couple of changes. One of the things that came up in our steering committee meeting was the ground floor and allowing a grocer. So we're allowing the podium to have a larger floor plate on the first floor, but everything above that is residential has to comply to the width and length standards. I made we had a reference to guest parking. I removed the guest parking reference based on the conversations we've had that it can be waived anyway. And the changes. Hold on,
you mentioned glass plates. Was there some change you were going to make to that on the ground floor?
Yeah, we talked about you know, whether the ground floor should have a 75% transparency or whether that's too high, and whether we go down to 50%.
Yeah,
you know, I don't know if you guys have an opinion.
I think 50% is a more reasonable number. Would that prevent people from going to more glass? I mean, it's sort of dependent on what the store is.
Well, and David, that's also, you know, it's below a certain height, has to be that percentage of transparency. And we cribbed that from a standard retail, you know, requirement for, you know, Main Street storefronts. So, you know, if it's in the, I believe that was in the downtown section, wasn't it, David?
Yep.
Right. And if you look at the level of transparency in most, not all, but in most of your, you know, historic storefronts, it's pretty good. I would say it's, I would try and keep that until they try and waive it.
Okay. Yeah, I think so too.
Ryan, do you remember any other changes that we made that were really germane here?
I think it was, you know, the we do allow the, you mentioned it already, the parking one was important to kind of figure out, because there's some big advantages to doing a podium. You know, you get a better housing product, honestly, you know, versus some of the other solutions. So we made that possible by removing some of the massing controls for that first level of ground level of parking. So
right, so you could do a parking, you could do a grocery store, as long as you had 30 feet along the street that was
right,
an active use.
We still don't allow the parking to come up to the street, which was the problem with some of the existing buildings. Larkspur.
Some other changes, there was a particular frontage type called a gallery, and we were asked to remove that. I think that was a comment by Julian. We removed the general section about civic spaces, because we're covering civic spaces just with the general open space requirements. There's the public open space requirement and the private open space requirement. For large projects, the public open space requirement could be a civic space, but we're not necessarily, there aren't large enough pieces of land that are buildable in Larkspur to really take advantage of like providing like a really large civic space. So we're including that as part of just the general open space strategy. Let's see. We revised the way that the building slope is looked at, and so we're allowing stepping of 40 and 65 foot sections, which is how the wood frame construction is done. You know, if you have like a 5 or a 10 foot setback or step back, it just doesn't work from a construction standpoint. So we're trying to make it more constructible. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to add to that any.
Yeah, but we still have pretty tight controls on how deep those steps are. So they're not significant in size. So I think what's good about having that very clearly described in the guidelines, which was an improvement over the original, is that there is no question they're not going to go past 40 feet in the lower standards, and in the higher standards they're not going past 65 in terms of that stepping, which will require the buildings to respect the slope of the site, but still be constructible.
Right. We are allowing that, you know, a design site repetition, you could have 3 design sites on a particular frontage. Again, for large properties, not too many that would apply to that, but we put in that because we have found that through site testing that it could occur. We've clarified on the podium issue, we've clarified the maximum width and depth for those uses. So we're referring to the setbacks as opposed to the massing standards.
And they're still controlled by design sites. So, you know, the design sites are really the master control for scale, for building scale. And so you're still like if you have a parcel that's really large and it's exceeds the maximum design site, then you're breaking it down and the garage has to conform to those smaller scale parcels so that you don't end up with something that's really out of scale in your city.
Yeah, and we've made it so that on a large site, a parking garage would be possible if done correctly. But again, I don't think there's a ton of properties in.
It's really only the sites that work best for parking structures in the traditional sense are near Marin Country Mart.
Yeah. For the common area open space requirement, it was originally 100 square feet per every 1,000 square feet of design site area. We've reduced it to 50. That just gets to an issue that when you get to those larger sites, 100, that's 10% of the site area. That can become pretty onerous, especially with all of the other guidelines that are in place. For other open space requirements, there was a requirement that you do private open space on roofs. We're saying you can also do it in enclosed courtyards.
At a 1.5 multiplier, right?
At a 1.5 multiplier.
So they have to provide more if they go that route.
For large sites, we originally had said that really large sites need to have 2 forms of connectivity in different directions through the site. Because some of the large sites are very unusual shapes. We're saying that 2 are preferred, but only 1 is required. So.
And that basically ensures that the site, instead of kind of being a sealed pod that only works for its own residents, it makes sure that it connects to other neighborhoods so that the public can travel through the site and actually go somewhere, which is, again, really important in that area around Marin Country Mart, that the street grid connect through these sites.
And there was a separate section under general design sites, which is chapter 4, and that was a section for bonus floor and height area. We basically took that as a separate section out, and that's included in the chapter 3 for each one of the individual zone allowances. And then I removed the guest parking requirement, which previously was 1 space for every 4 units, for the reason I mentioned previously. The road grade standards we removed. We're going to work on incorporating new road standards, and that would be only for private roads that are developed on a parcel. They're not within the public way. And we provided a few more different street options depending on, whether it's a street or a boulevard or a main street. And this is from table 4.060.A. Just to provide a little more opportunity for developers to have a wider range of how they actually develop the site. And then on the street width, on the sidewalk width on a street, an avenue and a boulevard, we reduced it by a foot. So originally, and this goes to chart 4.060B.
Can you say what page that's on? Sorry.
On the version I've got, it's page 90. It might be a couple pages before or after that.
Okay, that's
it's a full page chart. So for a street, we originally had an 11-foot minimum sidewalk, which would be some landscape and some sidewalk. Streets are pretty small. When you get to the avenue and boulevard, it was 13 feet. This was based on the original Optico standards. We reduced it to a 12-foot wide sidewalk. Minor change, but we left the 16-foot wide sidewalk for the main street because, again, you want to try to get outdoor dining and things like that. But a 12-foot, a 13-foot, and an 11-foot sidewalk, especially for a more neighborhood level street, seemed pretty wide. So those are the additional changes that were in the revised version.
Thank you. So are we then?
So I don't know how comfortable you are recommending modifications that we haven't seen. The one that gives me just more concern is just the podium allowance for commercial. I just personally would like to see how I don't want to, if you're approving a certain building form, I don't know that we want to give someone a break to do more than that for their commercial. it might make total sense. The recommendation that I had made was those kind of projects could come back for a development agreement. Like if the city wants a grocery store, we could work with the developer to come up with a different design that works with them, or they can apply for variances or a special planning district for that type of development. Because it wouldn't just be limited to one site. This would apply to every site that wants to do commercial. And so anyway, I'm more concerned about that because I haven't seen the rules at all.
I would say that it's not just commercial, but also if you're to do a traditional podium style building, which would have ground floor parking, and then you have a concrete podium where you have like, you know, a private courtyard area with a pool for the residents, and then the residential building goes around it. On the ground floor, you wouldn't see the parking, you'd see the retail that's on the street, but that's, you know, podium style construction is pretty typical, a little more expensive than.
It's typical, and it was definitely one of the types of construction that everyone was trying to avoid when we came up with the original toolkit because of just the appearance of it. It's maybe more practical, and there's certainly a lot of it in Larkspur in that residential areas. But
you need a pretty big site to pull it off.
Podium. I'm just curious to know what it looks like. Is there some way that we can make a recommendation to City Council excluding this one piece,
or maybe you could make a recommendation that the Planning Commission is open to the council looking at it, so that it's, if it makes sense, it can move forward. But
shouldn't that come through us first, or come through staff at least?
Or have staff review and make a recommendation to City Council on the changes or something. On other changes.
Is there a way to do that?
It's difficult because it's an ordinance. It's as if this piece is in your code, and you don't know what those changes are.
To City Council?
This September 6th, which means the staff report has to be done Monday.
Can we get that response back just on that one thing, and then we can?
But you won't have time to act on it.
Okay, that's true.
We don't have time to notice.
So what's the best way of handling
I guess the only way is if you somehow recommend that you could recommend it with their changes, and then then they can't deny it without coming back. So it just puts you in we could always come back to make modifications. I mean, that's always a possibility too. Like if it's something that just really.
You can do that later.
Yeah.
If we recommended that staff look at it.
Yeah, maybe it makes sense since it's done. Maybe this wouldn't be a terrible change to return to you after the document's approved.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a simple modification that you could just add in later.
And how do we do that? I mean, what happens if the City Council just approves it without?
Well, so if the City Council approves this version with whatever recommendations you're making, then like in October, we could bring a revision back to the Planning Commission to consider. And it would just go back to the City Council again, just to modify the document.
Do we have a guarantee we can do that then?
I mean, anytime you could bring anything back anytime. Okay. I mean, there's additional cost in having the consultant do more work, but maybe some of these pieces they've already done and we could just hold on to and bring back and incorporate later.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you think that works, we'll do it. I mean, it sounds like you need to get something in front of the City Council. We're trying to work with you on that. But also bear in mind that there's this one piece that we need to relook at. Yeah, some of the, like, we haven't looked at any of the, some of those changes, I just don't know what to recommend. And they might be totally fine. So some of them are actually in response to the comments towards the end of the document. There was comments made by Riley Hurd. Right, but like correcting number of stories, and then considering allowed location of bonus height. So those were part of the recommendations that are in here already, and some of them address those.
Most of the changes sounded
pretty reasonable,
pretty reasonable, yeah.
And the guest parking too, eliminating guest parking, I don't have an objection to that. It's obviously something that was very much of a concern on that last project, but we couldn't require that anyway. Someone will ask for a waiver from parking for sure. That's too easy. That's a really clear state law.
Can we make the recommendation that we send it to City Council, but highlight that particular issue and maybe even the guest parking issue and say, city,
The planning commission hadn't reviewed that yet.
We haven't reviewed it. We didn't make a determination on these two, but because of timeline, we had to get it to City Council. So we're asking them basically
to consider it. That's a great idea.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's do that.
I think that makes sense.
And maybe they can look at the guest parking as well, as since that's always seems to be a controversial issue.
Right.
And okay, so let's make a motion to push this forward, subject to all the changes that we just talked about,
right,
including the revisions proposed by the consultant, and but highlighting to the City Council that they specifically look at
certain ones that you hadn't seen.
We have not had a chance to look at, yeah.
But that were described to you at the meeting.
Yeah. Who's going to make that motion?
I mean, I would just say, I don't.
Do we need actually? I mean, I'll make the motion.
We should motion.
I would just make the motion. We can write it up.
Okay, so moved.
Oh,
second. Yeah.
I can't second. Yeah. Should we vote?
Yes. Should know you can look at your names right here in front of me. Commissioner Chalmers.
Yes.
Commissioner Wagstaff.
Yes.
Commissioner Campbell.
Yes.
And Commissioner Swisher had to leave and Commissioner Williamson is not present. So the motion carried 3-0 with 2 absent.
Right.
And this item is going to the City Council. So there's not really a right to appeal, but someone can go to the City Council and voice their concerns about the project at the City Council meeting on September 6th. And then that would be the introduction of the ordinance. And then there'll be a second meeting on September 20th, where they would consider adopting the ordinance and they might, I don't know, I think they'll probably, I don't know when they're going to adopt the resolution. It could be at either meeting, but there'll be a second meeting on adopting the ordinance on September 20th.
Okay, City Council, September 6th. Okay.
And I just want to say, thank you guys for, this is a big document. Thank you guys and to the consultants too for I assume many hours of work that went into preparing this. And
really
to the folks
well
on the
done.
housing steering committee. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into this that I think we appreciate and the city appreciates. So.
Oh, definitely. And thank you for saying that. And we should actually thank, because some of us here are volunteers, right, who are working on this project. So
we're all
volunteers. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you for all the discussion on that topic. Moving on to the business items, we need to approve the minutes. Oh, there's 2 sets of minutes. June 27 and July 25. Okay, does anyone like to make a motion or have any changes?
Do we need to do them one at a time, or?
I think we did them both previously. We just last time we did this, I think, didn't we just?
Oh, you could
do we not
together one at a time? Either way is fine.
I'll move approval of the minutes from June 27th and from July 25th.
I'll second.
We need a roll. Can we speak that? We can just say yes, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
And then do we have any planning commissioners reports? No. This is next.
Here, I wanted to mention, because sorry, the council member Carol, I meant to introduce him at the beginning to say that he is your council liaison, or he's the council liaison to the planning commission. So he was in attendance at the last meeting and is in attendance tonight. So just wanted to say that Kevin Carroll is he's here as the liaison. So listening in.
Thank you. Will he come in person one day?
So we could. Maybe he listens while he works, I don't know.
Okay, and if there's no planning commissioners report, so next meeting's on September 12th. Is anyone aware of being missing?
I will probably not. I'm flying back from the UK on the 11th.
Oh,
so
okay.
It might be a little tight. If you don't have a quorum.
Well, we'll be one down for sure, I think, right?
Yeah, we'll just make sure the other three can attend and we'll let you know if we're going to cancel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably do it, but
Yeah, I'll be.
I'll be here.
depends on how complicated the items are, because I would have about 2 hours to look at
Oh,
it.
I'm sure. Yes.
One item's complicated, but we could also give that item. I think we might have some material we can give you in advance.
In that case, can we have a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, I'll move to adjourn this meeting.
I'll second it.
And we all say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.